Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. In meeting 6, we will talk about adverb of frequency. Are these sentences true? The nurse always bathes the patients in the morning. The nurse usually gives medication to the patient after the patients have a meal. The nurse frequently checks the patient's vital signs in the afternoon. The nurses often feeds the patient by themselves. The nurses sometimes gives injection to patients. The nurses rarely make the patient's bed. The nurse hardly ever rounds up patients with doctor at night. And the nurse never has sick on Sunday. Okay, let's have a look at the underlined words. They are called adverbs of frequency. Always, usually, frequently, often, sometimes, rarely, hardly ever, and never. What do the underlined word mean? Yes, correct. Adverbs of frequency. Adverbs of frequency always means that you do it every day. Usually, not every day, but at least 6 days a week. Frequently, 4 days. Often, 4 days. Sometimes 3 days. Seldom, rarely, barely, 2 days, and hardly ever. Only once a week, and never. You never do that activity. How often do or does subject plus verb 1? Andy hardly ever makes the patient's bed. I often check the patient's condition. How many times do or does the subject plus verb 1? Andy makes the patient's bed once a week. I check the patient's condition 4 times a week. How often do you make the patient's bed? How many times does she perform hygiene? How many times do they check the patient's condition? How often does he prepare medication for the patients? You can choose number 1 or number 2. What about how often do you make the patient's bed? Okay, your answer is correct. I sometimes make the patient's bed. How many times does she perform hygiene? Very good. She performs hygiene once a week. How many times do they check the patient's condition? Great. They check the patient's condition in the morning 6 times a week. How often does he prepare medication for the patients? The answer is right. He often prepares medication for the patients. How often do we monitor the patient's vital signs? Yes, we frequently monitor the patient's vital signs every 6 hours. How often do you make a report? Right, I seldom make a report. How many times do you do the handover? Good, I do the handover every day. How many times does she give injection to patients? She doesn't give injection to patients. Practice 2. Arrange the words below into good sentences. You can start with Nurse Anita. Nurse Anita usually rounds up patients with doctor in the morning. Mrs. White and I always do handover before and after the shift. We always check the patient's vital signs every 4 hours. They sometimes prepare medication in the medication room. Cynthia. Cynthia rarely gives health education to the old patients. Nurses never check the patient's condition in the midnight. Mr. Bob and Mr. Sam hardly ever perform hygiene in the afternoon. Miss Natalie frequently reviews the patient's file in the nurse station. We feed the patients 3 times a day. I give injection to diabetes mellitus patients once a week. Use these adverbs in good sentences. That's the end.